From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The big debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump leaves Democrats newly worried about the 81-year-old incumbent president's age, with some even speculating whether he could be replaced on the ticket. Meantime, amid the jabs and insults, did we learn anything new about how each man would govern over the next 4 years? Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Kate Batchelder-Odell. On Friday, the Supreme Court dropped some big decisions, including one overturning Chevron deference. No decision yet on Trump immunity, so put a pin in that until next week when we will have a full Supreme Court term in review. But let's focus on Thursday's CNN debate between President Biden and President Trump, the first presidential debate of the 2024 cycle. According to the preliminary data in here now from Nielsen, it was watched by 48 million people on television, and who knows how many more are going to see clips of it and coverage of it. In a snap poll after the debate, 67% of watchers said that Trump turned in a better performance, and only 33% for President Biden. Kim, to my eye, the big story coming out of this is that breaking news, President Biden is 81 years old. He is not the man he used to be, and he's asking to stay in the Oval Office until he turns 86 years old. There were many moments at the debate where he, I think, looked his age. Here was one of the biggest to my eye, which came only about 15 minutes into the program.
We have 1,000 trillionaires in America. Billionaires in America. And what's happening? They're in a situation where they, in fact, pay 8.2% in taxes. If they just paid 24%, 25%, either one of those numbers, they'd raise $500 billion, I should say, in a 10-year period. We'd be able to wipe out his debt. We'd be able to help make sure that all those things we need to do, child care, elder care, making sure that we continue to strengthen our healthcare system, making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the with the COVID. With dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Thank you, President Biden. President Trump?
Well, he's right. He did beat Medicare. He beat it to death, and he's destroying Medicare.
Kim, that is a tough moment for the president, particularly given that his age, it seems to me, is his chief vulnerability in this race. Some polling in recent days showing that 70% of people right now think that the president is too old to do the job. And again, he wants to keep the job for another 4 years.
My question is, what debate were those 33% watching that said Joe Biden won? I'm not quite sure. It wasn't the one I was watching. This was an unmitigated disaster. In the history of modern debates, candidates, you can say they had a bad debate, but that's not equivalent to what we saw last night. This was 90 minutes of Joe Biden struggling to formulate thoughts, rasping out answers, mumbling. You couldn't understand a lot of what he said. A lot of it was watching him when Trump was speaking, where he seemed to be glassy-eyed, staring off into space, immobile. Everything that people have feared about Joe Biden and his abilities and his competence was on display for the nation to see. And we'd seen some of it in clips, little warnings from the few times that the administration has actually rolled him out to things. But this was a very bad evening for Joe Biden. And let's not forget, this was a debate he wanted, he asked for. The idea behind this was that by having it so early in the campaign season, they were going to try to reset the script and give him some new momentum against a Donald Trump who's been leading him in the polls. He reset the script. He now has the entire Democratic Party talking either behind scenes, many of them openly, about how they might be able to hoist him off the ballot and come up with a replacement. Now, I don't know if that's going to last. We have had smaller versions of these panics before. They have passed and everyone has resettled into the old paradigm. The Biden campaign was out today with a rally where he read forcefully from a teleprompter. This is going to be their attempt to gain control of this narrative and push back any movement for him to go. But this is just a game changer in this election and not to Joe Biden's benefit.
We have a clip of that response by Joe Biden from a rally in Raleigh, North Carolina, to my eye, clearly showing that he knows his debate performance last night is going to be a problem for the public.
I know I'm not a young man. State the obvious. Well, I know. I don't walk as easy as I used to. I don't speak as smoothly as I used to. I don't debate as well as I used to. But I know what I do know. I know how to tell the truth. I know how to get things done. And I know, like millions of Americans know, when you get knocked down, you get back up.
Kate, if that was the Joe Biden who had showed up on the debate stage, we would probably be having a different conversation. That sounded more like the guy who gave a State of the Union address this year that was reasonably well received. And I don't know if the difference is teleprompter on, teleprompter off, or if it's the time of day, or if it's just that when you get older, you have good days and you have bad days. But you can't have bad days when you're the president of the United States and the phone rings and a U.S. adversary is making some aggressive move overseas. And I do wonder now which of these presidents and most of the staff in the White House is used to seeing. And maybe we'll find out in their memoirs someday. But it does seem to me like it has been a disservice to shield the public from the reality of President Biden, at least on some days, at least the reality that we saw last night. And this might be also a place where having a friendly press has worked to the disadvantage of the Democrats and the Democratic candidate, because they covered for him for a while now and now led them to the point where all the primaries are over. He's got almost all of the delegates. We're about to go into the Democratic convention, and then we see Joe Biden in real life.
Right. I do think that was a disservice to the Democratic Party and the choices that they had to make. I mean, at this point, I agree with Kim that there's already an effort to kind of make this moment pass, and getting him off the ballot would be very hard. Getting his campaign funds transferred to another candidate would be a challenge. Kamala Harris is, if you can even ponder it, even less popular than he is, and voters have more concerns about her. So she's been sort of an insurance policy to keeping him on the ballot. And then other candidates that get floated around, like Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, I don't know if he's going to electrify voters the way some Democrats imagine. Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan has not been subject to as much national scrutiny as I think people think. So they have exclusively bad choices here, but I do think it's a mistake to just assume that this is all going to blow over and that voters will ultimately forget about it. I mean, to your point about today at the rally, the president sounds okay. Well, it's in the middle of the day and it's a highly scripted event versus having to debate somebody in a dynamic environment. So I think that does explain the difference. But I think most people understand that, to your point about the things that the president deals with, being the president of the United States is a very dynamic job. And so I don't think it's going to be easy to just brush off these perceptions of how he's able to handle it. Now, I will say that I did think Trump succeeded more by Biden's failure than really anything he did. He was different. I went back and watched some of those 2020 debates for my sins, as we say, to compare them. And he was quite restrained. He stuck more on the issues and did much less hectoring than, for instance, I'm thinking of remembering the Hillary Clinton debate where he yells, "No, you're a puppet." There was none of that last night, which I think was constructive and good for Trump. But I also don't know that he did a lot for himself other than just standing there and letting Biden collapse.
Hang tight. We'll be right back in a moment. Welcome back. Kim, what do you make of this idea of Democrats having an open convention and subbing somebody in for Joe Biden? I think it is pretty clear in the Democratic Party rules that he has the delegates and there's no way to force him out. Only the guy who's in the cockpit can reach the lever for the eject button. And the argument that that is never going to happen is that Joe Biden has wanted to be president since at least 1987. He thinks he's doing a good job, a historic job. He has a loyal cabinet that is pushing through his policies through the administrative state. day in and day out, and he's surrounded by a staff that's telling him what he wants to hear. But I do wonder what might happen if the polls start to show movement toward Trump by voters in the wake of this debate. If Trump opens up a 5-point lead in the national polling and a loss for Democrats starts to look inevitable, I wonder if you couldn't have high-level Democrats, people who President Biden trusts, going to him and saying, listen, you have two choices here. You can be the president who saved the country from Donald Trump and then did the right thing and stepped aside and put the country above your own personal interests and ambitions and made room for somebody else to continue beating Donald Trump. Or you can be the president who defeated Donald Trump and did some policy that Democrats wanted and then had it all reversed in the second Trump term. And Kim, I don't know how likely that is, but at this point, it doesn't seem impossible, or at least it seems less impossible than it did earlier this week.
Let's see where the polls go. I think that's going to be a key factor in what comes next. Again, as I noted, we've had some moments of panic like this in the past over Joe Biden's age. This is much more of an uproar. I think one key question will be whether those polls not only show Donald Trump with a widening lead nationally and in swing states, but if it begins to affect down ballot Democrats, because that has been a bit of a distinction here, is that if you look at the polling, a lot of senatorial and House candidates have continued to perform a lot better than the president. If he looks as though he's going to be the cause of a mammoth tidal wave against his party, that might be something that causes him to act. You are correct. He will not go easily. Right now, you have a guy, people sometimes forget this. This is not a humble man. He's pretty arrogant. He's insulated. He tends to only listen to a group of family and very close advisors, including Jill, his wife, and this kind of wise man circle he's had around him for 20 or 30 years. There's been some talk about deputizing, some senior leaders, Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer, as a delegation to go to him and make the case. It's going to take a lot to get him to step down. Now, a couple of things, too, that are problematic for Democrats. One kink I will throw out there, because of Ohio law, every party has to have finalized its candidate by August 7th in that state. So Democrats had already decided that they were going to upend their traditional roll call process for delegates ahead of their actual convention, which doesn't come until the end of August. So in theory, if they still wanted to do that, they've got 40 days to work this out. Now, they could always just say, look, we're not going to win as a president level in Ohio anyway. Forget it. We're going to have an open convention. But that is one technical, complicated thing that they're going to have to work out if they decide to go down this path. They also have the major problem of, what do you do with Kamala Harris, who is less popular than even Joe Biden at the moment? And one big reason why they haven't made any big movements so far is because they don't know how to work through that thorny issue. So there's going to be a lot of bullet biting if they decide this is the path they're going to go down. My own fear is that that list of complications will throw them back into the same inertia that has gripped the party up until now.
Let's turn to Donald Trump's performance, and particularly one issue where I think he scored some points against President Biden, and that is on foreign policy. Let's listen to a clip here.
As far as Russia and Ukraine, if we had a real president, a president that knew, that was respected by Putin, he would have never invaded Ukraine. A lot of people are dead right now, much more than people know. They talk about numbers. You can double those numbers, maybe triple those numbers. He did nothing to stop it. In fact, I think he encouraged Russia from going in. I'll tell you what happened. He was so bad with Afghanistan. It was such a horrible embarrassment, most embarrassing moment in the history of our country, that when Putin watched that and he saw the incompetence, that he should have fired those generals, like I fired the one that you mentioned. And so he's got no love lost, but he should have fired those generals. No general got fired for the most embarrassing moment in the history of our country, Afghanistan, where we left billions of dollars of equipment behind. We lost 13 beautiful soldiers, and 38 soldiers were obliterated. And by the way, we left people behind, too. We left American citizens behind.
Kate, what do you make of this and the prospect of each of these guys as commander-in-chief over the next 4 years?
Well, I think you're right that to some extent, this was a devastating case about Afghanistan. I mean, when you look at Joe Biden's approval ratings, he goes underwater during the Afghanistan withdrawal, and his presidency has never fully recovered from that dip. I think it was a defining moment of his presidency where voters formed certain conclusions. I think what Trump is saying about Ukraine is also correct. And what he's fundamentally saying is that you can't seal off regions of the world, that what America does in Afghanistan, and it's showing that it's on the way out, that it's in retreat, that it's going to just leave this to somebody else's problem, that's going to radiate to other parts of the world, to Europe, to Asia, and not just be something we can just deal with by itself. However, I think Trump has some contradictions to sort out, because Trump basically said my withdrawal from Afghanistan would have been more orderly. And I think this is a canard. Maybe he wouldn't have closed Bagram Air Base prematurely, but there was no way to get out of Afghanistan in an orderly fashion given the collapse of the government. And on the same page, I really thought, explaining how this did have a connection to Ukraine was useful for voters. But then he basically said about Ukraine that the war never would have happened. He would have prevented it with his personal bravado. And also, we've just spent a bunch of money on Ukraine, and basically suggesting, again, as he said before, well, I'll just end the war in 24 hours, even before I'm in office, details to follow. I think this is really unsatisfying to voters, and it's a huge issue where they're not getting much from either candidate. I think it was also a mistake on Trump's part to let Biden off the hook for the current situation in Ukraine. I mean, if I were advising Trump, I would have told him to say, it's not an issue of how much money we spent in Ukraine, but of Biden's policies. I mean, why did Biden take so long to arm the Ukrainians for their counteroffensive? Why did he give the Russians a full winter to dig trenches? Why has he taken a year to give them F-16s and only trained 12 pilots in the Air Force? I mean, he has been slow and halting in Ukraine, and it has contributed to the stalemate or to the fixed fight we see there. And the Americans are frustrated with that. They largely want Ukraine to win. There was a poll about this recently that said 3/4 of Americans think it's important for Ukraine to win to the United States. But they are frustrated with what they see there, and that there doesn't appear to be a clear path to victory. So again, I think it's frustrating that Trump does have some core things right and has really identified a core vulnerability of the president's, which is that the world is falling apart. But he's not able to make that fuller case of how he would prevail in a way that's in America's interest. And I do think voters are looking for that. So I think what's unfortunate is that I think there is an extent to which Americans looked at Biden and thought, I'm not even sure he's up for the demands of being commander in chief for the next few months, let alone for the next 4 years. But Trump continues to be somewhat erratic and doesn't really articulate how he thinks about these things. So it's more of a wash than it really should have been, is I guess my core takeaway.
Hang tight. We'll be right back after one more break. Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Kim, what do you make of Trump's performance overall? I guess my 2 cents is that I would agree with what Kate said a moment ago, that he seemed relatively restrained. It seemed like he had been prepped. Some of this dynamic might be due to CNN's rules that after a candidate's turn was over, they would hit the mute button so that microphone would be turned off. That was a demand that the Biden campaign had, by the way, which might have backfired by making Trump more controllable than he was in some of those 2020 debates. But he had particularly prepped answers, I think, on questions that he knew were coming. He was asked whether he would take retribution on political opponents if he got back into the Oval Office. And he said, my success will be my retribution. He was asked about January 6th, and he said, on January 6th, we didn't have this inflation. We didn't have this border problem. It seemed like he knew those questions were coming and had answers prepared. Though there were a couple points, I think, where his anger got the best of them. Here was one of them when he was asked whether he would accept the results of the 2024 election.
If it's a fair and legal and good election, absolutely. I would have much rather accepted these, but the fraud and everything else was ridiculous. And if you want, we'll have a news conference on it in a week, or we'll have another one of these in a week. But I will absolutely, there's nothing I'd rather do.
Kim, that was a bit of back to the old stolen election stuff, but remarkably little of that last night.
Overall, I think Trump did what he needed to do, which was to remember that this was not a campaign rally, that he was not speaking to people that are already devoted Trump voters, but rather speaking to broader Americans who needed to be convinced. He came in and he was restrained. Remember, people were expecting him to be grimacing and yelling and interrupting despite the muted microphones. He seemed to have absorbed the rules and decided that he was going to abide by them. He came across as relatively restrained. He had those facts. There were a couple of exchanges, by the way, too, on the core issue that most voters are focused on in this election, which is the economy. I think he made a very persuasive case for his taxes and linked it to growth in the economy, low unemployment, greater investment, companies bringing their operations back to the United States as a result of that. I thought he did well on the inflation exchange, very much making the case that this was a result of Joe Biden's overspending and problems that came about because of Joe Biden's presidency. He was pretty devastating on immigration, which is also an issue that is top of voters' minds. But look, let's also be clear. Trump mostly benefited from having an opponent that put in such a poor performance. There were moments when Trump made arguments that Joe Biden could have rounded back on him on. This was a very Trumpian performance too, a lot of exaggerations that I think a better, more capable opponent would have rounded back and called him out for. He also, I have to say this, on a number of important questions, he just glazed over them. I mean, Kate mentioned one, what exactly are you going to do in Ukraine to stop the fighting? How does that plan out? He didn't really give a very good example or any details on that. He glossed over what he would do for childcare in that question. He had no answer on the coming problems with Social Security. So there were a number of things. And again, had he had a better opponent, Joe Biden would have ripped him to shreds at that moment for not answering the question. But instead, because of the weakness of his opponent and I think the rules, interestingly, of this debate that kind of changed topics frequently and limited the amount of time, there wasn't a lot of pressure on him to have to fully give answers on anything.
It was almost, in some sense, a win by default. Another place where he did not answer a direct question from the moderators was on his call for mass deportations. He was asked, are you really going to deport 10 or maybe 15 million people who are in the country illegally? And what about people who have U.S. citizen spouses and U.S. citizen children? And he did not say anything, I think, in real response to that question. And Kate, I think Kim is exactly on point here that the moderators a couple times made note of the fact that this was the question I asked you. I'm going to repeat it. Would you like to answer that? And he kept on turning it back toward Joe Biden's record in office. And in some sense, it's up to the debate opponent to press that advantage. And Joe Biden was just not capable of doing that on the stage last night.
Right. To underscore the point about unforced errors. If I'm recalling right, remember when Biden was asked a question about abortion, and he, for some reason, veered off into uncharted territory on immigration. This was extremely odd. Abortion is an issue that Democrats have been winning on, even in red states that are otherwise unfriendly to Joe Biden. I mean, there's a referendum in Florida on abortion that is polling in the 60% or looks likely to pass. So this has basically been the Democratic signature issue for multiple cycles now. But for some reason, Biden, first of all, laid out this totally indecipherable three-pronged standard about abortion that Democrats supposedly hold, that he was trying to take out of Roe. And I think, the charitable reading being trying to explain how Roe tries to balance competing interests between the woman and the unborn fetus. But I do think also Trump managed to get him on the defensive on abortion, which was very startling. I mean, Trump talked in a lot of detail about, Democrats, for all the obsession about where to draw the line, Democrats say that there is no line and are willing to accept abortion up to birth, is what Trump basically was saying. And he got Joe Biden to say, we don't support late-term abortions. That, I think, would be a surprise to a lot of Joe Biden's left progressive base that has been arguing that there should never be a standard or any sort of government intervention into a decision over an abortion. So that is, I think, an illustrative moment, because even on an issue where Republicans have really struggled to come up with a coherent response, The president was on the defensive last night, and I don't think that was as much about Trump's success as it was about just Biden's inability to defend his platform. So I think that about sums it up.
Thank you, Kate and Kim. Thank you all for listening. You can email us your own debate reactions at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.